Please be seated. The court is now back in session. Once again, the floor is given to the co-prosecutors to continue their presentation on the closing statement. You may now proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to continue. In a speech published in the Revolutionary Flag of September 1977, Pol Pot confirmed that CPK had a specific strategy to cut off all the enemy's food supplies. Your Honors, we submit that the evidence of the actions and statements of these accused in directing and encouraging atrocities against the civilian population of Phnom Penh demonstrates their intent to harm that population. The evidence of the massive suffering which they were causing knowingly and intentionally for months before 17 April 1975 discredits entirely the defense's claims that the accused actually intended to help the population. To state the obvious, this evidence demonstrates beyond any doubt that the accused bear responsibility for the dire humanitarian situation in Phnom Penh. They intended to cause that suffering because, as I demonstrated earlier, they deemed the population of the city to be the real or potential enemy. And yet, before you today, they seek to invoke that very suffering to construct a false reason for their forced evacuation of the city. A further relevant event in this period is the decision of the Khmer Rouge leadership to execute senior members of the Khmer Republic regime. On 24th and 25th February 1975, Khieu Samphan presided over the Second Phunk and Grunk National Congress, which declared that senior Khmer Republic officials, namely Lun Nol, Sirimata, Sơ Ngọc Thanh, Cheng Heng, N Tem, Long Boret, and Sustain Fernandez were the chieftains of the traitors, and that it was absolutely necessary to kill them. Two of these 7 individuals, Prime Minister Long Boret and Prince Sirimata, remained in Phnom Penh and were arrested and executed with numerous other senior representatives of the Khmer Republic regime. The evidence shows that on 17 April 1975, the Khmer Rouge officers on the ground were fully aware of this order. My colleague will present evidence of numerous public statements by the leadership affirming their call for the execution of the top leaders of Khmer Republic regime. It is also important to note the effect of the resolution of the Second Congress on other officials or representatives of the local government and military. The Congress proclaimed that other low or high-ranking government officials, army officers, police officers from the Khmer Republic regime could join the FUNC, but only provided they immediately ceased their service to the 7 traitors and stopped cooperating with them. As noted by Philip Short, the implication of this statement: first, if you don't join the revolution immediately, you will be in the same category as the super traitors. As we will see, in the days following the fall of Phnom Penh, thousands of Khmer Republic military and civilian officers were murdered in cold blood by Khmer Rouge forces in an organized and systematic operation. Dear Honours, I will now move on to deal with the entry of Khmer Rouge troops into Phnom Penh, the surrender of the Khmer Republic regime, and the arrest and execution of senior members of that regime. In this manner, we will set the scene for the crimes committed during the forced evacuation, which I will address in detail later in my submissions. In this part of my presentation, I will refer to the diary and testimony of Sidney Schanberg, the diary of John Swain, and the testimony of Al Rockoff. The accounts of these men are significant because they record the events throughout the capital in the dying days of the Khmer Republic and in the first hours and days of Khmer Rouge rule. As journalists, these individuals had an eye for detail and sought to record the key events that were taking place around them. On 16 April 1975, the Khmer Rouge continued to shell the city throughout the day and into the night. The Khmer Republic Army's main ammunition dams were surrounded. The Khmer Rouge announced in a radio broadcast that they had occupied the airport at Pochintong. Some of the victims of the attack were being treated at the Preket Mili Hospital, which Sidney Schanberg described in his diary as a slaughterhouse. The sick and wounded were also being treated at other locations, including at an impromptu medical surgery established at Hotel Le Phnom, the site of the current Raffles Hotel, which was declared a protected neutral area and draped with large Red Cross banners. Staff from the Red Cross admitted hundreds of refugees into the hotel in the early evening of 16 April. CPK military divisions from the north, southwest, east, and special zones had surrounded Phnom Penh. Shortly before midnight, Sidney Schanberg spoke on the telephone with Long Boret, the Prime Minister of Khmer Republic. Mr. Boret was one of the 7 traitors targeted for execution on the order of Khieu Samphan. The Prime Minister told Mr. Steinberg, "We feel completely abandoned. We have no more material means." He confirmed that the government had made and agreed to surrender. Victory for the Khmer Rouge was therefore imminent and inevitable. Before dawn on 17 April, the President of the Supreme Council of the Khmer Republic, Lieutenant General Sakhon, transmitted an offer of surrender to the advancing forces, committing to an immediate transfer of power. He asked only for no reprisals. His offer was not accepted. There was no transfer of power. Only terror was to follow. Much of the evidence you have heard about this day is corroborated by transcripts of radio broadcasts produced by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, that is the FIBIS. One such report records a Khmer Rouge broadcast at 9 a.m., confirming that advancing Khmer Rouge forces had poured in and fanned across the city in encountering little resistance. John Swain, who was staying at Hotel Le Phnom, wrote about how sections of the Khmer Republic military and the civilian population were making preparations to welcome the incoming troops. Quote, "White flags were beginning to sprout everywhere, on armored personnel carriers drawn up outside the hotel, on houses in the northern sector of the city that the Khmer Rouge had just penetrated. The Cambodian army was about to pack up after 5 years of war. Troops took out the clips of their M16 rifles and waited quietly in the sunlight for the insurgents." End of quote. And here is the video clip to follow. Conscious of the need to avoid bloodshed, senior religious figures made broadcasts for calm and peace on the Phnom Penh radio. Within minutes, Mr. Mei Si-chan, chairman of the Khmer Republic Army General Staff, ordered all his forces to cease fire. He asked the population to remain calm. Referring to Khmer Rouge as brothers, he stated, quote, "I and the Special Committee of Army Officers will make arrangements with representatives of the Organization of Brother Cambodians of the other side to achieve safety and order and to find peace for our blood brothers from this moment onward." End of quote. General Si-chan invited the Khmer Rouge to come to Phnom Penh and are the provincial capitals which are open to you. But the Khmer Rouge had not attacked the city in order to accept invitations or to undertake negotiations. The Khmer Rouge officers had arrived at the radio station and made their own broadcast immediately after the general's appeal. Their message was direct, unambiguous, and abrupt. Quote, "We inform the contemptible, treacherous Lunol clique and all its commanders that we are not coming here for negotiations. We are entering the capital through force of arms of the CPNLAF." End of quote. In the same broadcast, the Khmer Rouge officer summoned all CPNLAF commanders to meet at the National Ministry of Information. John Swain described the Khmer Rouge soldiers as well armed and disciplined. This is corroborated by Sidney Schanberg, who stated in his diary that the Khmer Rouge soldiers he saw were an army of battle-hardened, disciplined, or business soldiers. In an article published on 9 May 1975, Mr. Schanberg wrote that, quote, "The troops we saw in Phnom Penh did include women soldiers and the boy militia, some of whom seemed no more than 10 years old, but all looked healthy, well organized. They were heavily armed and well trained." End of quote. Al Rokov, a United States Army veteran who had served in the Vietnam War, was working in Phnom Penh as a freelance photographer. He spent hours in the morning at the junction of Sihanouk Boulevard and Monivong Boulevard. He testified that there was a very good radio network among the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Mr. Rokov testified that he saw soldiers of the Khmer Republic surrendering their weapons and then hundreds of them being marched in a westerly direction from the intersection of Monivong Boulevard and Sihanouk Boulevard. He also confirmed that a photograph taken by Roland Niveau showed the same movement of Khmer Republic prisoners that he saw on the day. Mr. Schanberg, Swain, Rokov, and Det Pran, Schanberg's friend and interpreter, went to Preket Mili Hospital and witnessed patients bleeding to death in the corridors. As they were leaving the hospital, the 3 foreigners were arrested by Khmer Rouge soldiers. They were held by the Khmer Rouge for several hours before they were released. Due to the limited time, I will not discuss this incident in detail. But one key aspect of the event is how Khmer Rouge military command exercised control over their soldiers on the ground. Mr. Schanberg and Mr. Rokov were certain that they would be executed by the Khmer Rouge. Their lives were saved by the pleas of their Cambodian friend and colleague, Mr. Det Pran. To secure the release of his friends, Mr. Pran had to go to Khmer Rouge headquarters together with a Khmer Rouge officer that evidence demonstrates that on 17 April 1975, Khmer Rouge soldiers were neither out of control nor unruly. Instead, they were disciplined and organized, and they followed their chain of command. They sought and obtained the orders of their superiors as to what to do with the foreigners. Mr. Schenberg also testified that while he and the other foreigners were released, the Khmer Republic military men whom the Khmer Rouge had captured were not set free. Later, Mr. Schenberg and his colleagues went to the Ministry of Information and there saw senior Khmer Republic officials whom they described as prisoners of the Khmer Rouge. According to Sini Schenberg's diary, and I quote, "We head for the Information Ministry because of the earlier broadcast asking high officials of the old regime to report there. When we arrived, about 50 prisoners are standing outside the building, which seems to be the insurgents' temporary headquarters. Among the prisoners are Brigadier General Lun Non, younger brother of Marshal Lun Nol, Brigadier General Chum Chun, who was close to the Marshal. Other generals and cabinet ministers are also there. Very uneasy, but trying to appear calm. We learn that the chief monks of the two main Buddhist sects have already been there and been sent back to their pagodas. There was a toughness to the atmosphere. A platoon of young Khmer Rouge soldiers slipped into foxholes on the lawn and behind trees and pillars. Training machine guns and rocket launchers on the scene. John Swain's detailed observations were recorded in his article published in the Times. He saw with his own eyes the Khmer Rouge policy of segregation and targeting, of which you will hear more when I deal with the killing of Khmer Republic officials. He wrote, and I quote, "Back at the Ministry of Information, a man in black, about 35, and clearly a leader, bowled through a bullhorn at the prisoners, dividing them into three groups: military, political, and ordinary civilians. The Khmer Rouge training their guns on them were tough, strong looking. To us standing there, they looked like people from another planet." End of quote. Sini Schenberg describes the same segregation. In his testimony, Mr. Schenberg summed up his observations of the Khmer Republic officials at the Ministry of Information as follows. Quote, "They were clearly frightened, and I think most of them knew they were going to be killed." End of quote. He also confirmed the following passage from his diary, and I quote, As the conversation continues, Lun Non slips forward and quietly asked a French newsman to ask the insurgent leader if the prisoners here today or other Cambodian officials can leave the country if they wish to. A few moments later, the newsman gets a chance to ask the question. The military leader laughs softly. It will depend on the government, he says. They will make the regulations. He says he is only a military leader, adding that some of the top political and governmental leaders are not far from the city, but that they had let the military enter first to organize things. End of quote. Al-Rokov took a photograph outside the Ministry of Information at approximately 4 p.m. that day, when he was there together with John Swain and Sidney Schanberg. 38 years later, he came to testify before you. He knew precisely how important his photograph was when he explained, quote, "But this is my photograph. I consider that a very important historical photograph, a transition." End of quote. As to what exactly was happening when he pressed the shutter to take this photograph, Rokov said, and I quote, "One of the Lunar regime officers was discussing, trying to make a point or two to the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge were watching. One Khmer Rouge was taking a photo of the journalist getting off the track. I had a camera hanging around my neck. I didn't raise it to my eye. I had a wide angle lens. I took a photo just as a person was coming over to grab my camera equipment from me." End of quote. The photograph proves that the Khmer Rouge were, within hours of their arrival in Phnom Penh, targeting and segregating Khmer Republic officials. This evidence exposes the myth being peddled by the defense that no such policy existed. The defense myth is further exposed by evidence you have heard about generals in the Khmer Republic regime, including General Taj Sari. You heard testimony from his cousin, Ms. Tuj Pandaraso, explaining that the general went to the Ministry of Information in response to the Khmer Rouge broadcast. General Taj Sari was executed along with the other Khmer Republic officials who had presented themselves at the Ministry of Information. His death is corroborated by a subsequent French press agency report listing the names of 54 generals executed by the Khmer Rouge. Brigadier General Jim Chun, who was also detained at the ministry at the same time as General Taj Sari, is also on the list of those reportedly executed. At the ministry, Sini Schenberg also witnessed the arrival of the Prime Minister of the former Khmer Republic, Longboret. Longboret was later executed. After authorization for his death had been issued from the very top level of the CPK leadership, the Committee for Wiping Out Enemies. According to Philip Short, the circumstances were, quote, Prime Minister Longboret, Lon Nol and other senior Republicans were taken out and killed in the grounds of the Cirque Sportif, not far from the Information Ministry, where they had been detained. End of quote. Mr. Schenberg describes his departure from the Ministry of Information as follows. Quote, as we leave the Information Ministry, the prisoners are being taken inside the building. It is the last we saw of them. End of quote. After Sini Schenberg and his colleagues left the Ministry of Information, they observed that the forced evacuation of the city was in full flow. In this courtroom, Sini Schenberg describes the population as being driven out of the city, not driven in cars, but driven like you drive cows, out of the city into the countryside. Within the hour, Schenberg arrived at the French embassy, which became a refuge for him and other foreigners for the next 13 days. He was confronted by a chaotic situation recorded in his diary. And I quote, at the French embassy, there is pandemonium. The gates are shut and locked to prevent the mob from surging in. But people by the dozens, including Cambodians, are coming in anyway, passing their children over the tall iron spike fence, then hurling their belongings over, and finally climbing over themselves. End of quote. Prince Sirimata had gained access to the French embassy, despite the fact that he had been condemned to death by the order of Khieu Samphan. The Khmer rules were, though, intent on finding him and killing him. The order had to be implemented. A number of other Khmer Republic officials also entered the French embassy seeking asylum. They were all to be handed over to the Khmer Rouge. And I would like now to show another video clip. Throughout the following days, the Khmer Rouge Committee, which communicated with the French consul, that is Mr. Jean Dirac, demanded that all Cambodians leave the embassy and head north into the countryside. According to Mr. Schenberg, some 500 Cambodians had sought refuge within the compound. Mr. Schenberg's diary also recorded the separation of families which followed as the Cambodians were forced out of the embassy compound. A telegram sent by the French consul to the French Foreign Ministry in Paris on 21st April described the separation of families and the expulsion of Cambodians from the compound. It states, quote, "The pain is unbearable for all. Some are parting ways after 15 or 20 years of living together. Here, even the men cry. Yesterday, a little boy was born at the embassy. His mother must leave today. The little boy became my son today. We adopted him." End of quote. While the ordinary Cambodians were forced to leave the embassy under Khmer Rouge orders, the high-ranking Khmer Republic officials were to be. Rather, Mr. Schenberg also describes how, once the large group of Cambodians left the embassy on 21st April, Khmer Rouge officers swept the compound to expel any remaining Cambodian nationals. While the ordinary Cambodians were forced to leave the embassy under Khmer Rouge orders, the high-ranking Khmer Republic officials were to be handed over to Khmer Rouge forces. Telegrams from the French embassy record this. A telegram on the 18th April 1975, entitled "Political Asylum," confirms that several senior personalities were in the embassy compound. They included Sirimata, Princess Mom Manong, Ung Bun Hao, the Khmer Republic President of National Assembly, and Mr. Leung Nak, Khmer Republic's Minister for Health. In the telegram, Dirac stated, quote, "Barring express and immediate order from the department requesting me to grant political asylum, I will be compelled to turn these names in within 24 hours." End of quote. As confirmed in another telegram dated 20 April, on that day, Sirimata and the other people mentioned in the previous telegram were handed into the custody of the Khmer Rouge. This evidence demonstrates the Khmer Rouge organized and systematic searches for Khmer Republic officials who were destined for execution. As recorded by the organization Amnesty International, Ieng Sary confirmed publicly at a press conference in Bangkok in November 1975 that Long Boret, Sirimata, and Lon Nol had been executed. The evidence before the court also establishes the organized executions of hundreds of other Khmer Republic military officers and officials in the course of and immediately following the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Your Honours, I will now deal with the evidence of the crimes committed in the course of forced transfer of the population from Phnom Penh in April 1975 and the forced movements of the civilian population to the north and northwest zones starting from September 1975. The evidence before you demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt the existence of a joint criminal enterprise to commit these crimes, the criminal intent of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan to commit the crimes, as well as the violence and brutality with which the crimes were committed. As I stated in my opening remarks, the common theme that runs through these events is the use of extreme violence against a civilian population. On 17 April 1975 and the days and weeks following, tens of thousands of people were killed by the infliction of inhumane conditions during the forced marches and shortly upon arrival in CPK-administered cooperatives and work sites. Many were executed during the evacuations, and millions were victimized by forced transfer under inhumane conditions from their homes. The forced transfer of the inhabitants of Phnom Penh was a cataclysmic event. Human suffering on a devastating scale was a direct and inevitable result of the order to evacuate the city without exception. Expert witness Philip Short captured this in his book, and I quote, "To move more than 2.5 million people out of a crowded metropolis at a few hours' notice, with nowhere for them to stay, no medical care, no government transport, and little or nothing to eat, was to invite human suffering on a colossal scale." End of quote. And I'd like to present another video clip here. Philip Short also testifies that the enormous suffering inflicted on the civilians during the forced evacuations of the cities in April 1975 was not an exception. Instead, it was characteristic of CPK's treatment of the civilian population throughout their rule. Mr. Short stated, and I quote, "The ruthlessness and single-mindedness and the lack of concern for human values, for human suffering, for individual values that were shown during the evacuation, in everything the same approach, and in many cases the same finalities, that is, large numbers of deaths along the way, were how those programs were characterized, and you find all that in the very first step, which was the evacuation of the cities." End of quote. The evacuation was carried out swiftly. The statement before this court, a civil party Chan Sopip, described the resolve and speed with which the Khmer Rouge soldiers forced the civilians out of their homes. She stated, and I quote, "On the 17th April 1975, I, as the rest of the Phnom Penh residents, were immediately forced to evacuate from Phnom Penh. I had 13 blood brothers and sisters, including my parents. There were 15 of us in total. The war was ended, and I hoped that peace would come. But, on the contrary, at around 9 a.m., Khmer Rouge soldiers with weapons entered our house, and they told us to leave the house for 3 days, as they needed to get rid of the enemy. At that time, my parents had prepared our meal, and we could not even eat the meal yet, and another group of soldiers came to force us to leave." End of quote. The Khmer Rouge soldiers who expelled the residents out of the city were heavily armed, disciplined, and well organized. In his diary of the events, Sidney Sandberg described how they went about their business. Quote, "Teams of insurgent soldiers waving pistols and rifles, some shouting and some using bullhorns, were ordering people to leave their homes instantly. The rebels fired shots in the air to demonstrate they meant business." End of quote. In expanding on this passage in his testimony, Mr. Sandberg stated it was clear that they were trying to get them out of their houses and get them on the road quickly, and it worked. Sum Chi was one of these Khmer Rouge soldiers. His testimony to you was detailed and sharp, and I will refer to it repeatedly. With a soldier's plain words, he testified as to what his job really was. Quote, "Our mission was to evacuate all people out of the city. We had to do whatever we could to make sure the people left the city." End of quote. According to Sum Chi, they took 5 days to empty the city of most of its population. And I'd like to present another short video clip. As Sumchi indicated, no exceptions were made to the execution of this brutal order. Everyone had to go. Every home, every school, every hospital, every workplace, every place where people were, was to be emptied. Denise Afonso testified, and I quote, "If we hadn't left, they would have taken us for traitors and imperialists and people who were in the pay of the old regime, and they would have massacred us." End of quote. Describing the actions of the Khmer Rouge forces later in her testimony, Ms. Afonso said, quote, "They went through the streets. They were shouting the orders in the streets, and then individually they went to each house and each apartment to repeat the order that we had to evacuate the city. We had absolutely no choice whatsoever." End of quote. Consistent with Ms. Afonso's evidence, witnesses uniformly testified that there was no choice but to leave the city. From what they were told by the Khmer Rouge soldiers and from seeing their conduct, the residents knew that refusing to comply with the order would lead to beatings, abuse, or death. They left their homes because they feared for their lives. I will quote only a few additional accounts of witnesses and civil parties which demonstrate this. Bodina said, "They warned us that if we failed to leave immediately, they would destroy everything. They threatened our life too." And Ms. Yum Sowan also stated, "As we received a severe threat, we had to prepare and pack our things and leave." Mr. On Polly stated that everyone had to follow the orders by the Khmer Rouge. Where they wanted us to go, we had to go. As for Ms. Cheng Eng Lee, she stated that I had no choice but to leave my house. And Ms. Bay Sopani stated, "I did not leave my house on my own free will." Mr. Chowne also stated that Khmer Rouge soldiers made an announcement asking people to leave Phnom Penh. At that time, I heard gunfire. I also heard the screaming of people looking for their relatives and friends in their preparation to leave Phnom Penh. At that time, the Khmer Rouge people were armed. They approached the front of my brother's house and shouted that we all had to leave. As Chowne's account demonstrates, armed force was used to ensure the population complied with the evacuation order. Ms. Mom Som Eun gave a vivid illustration of this. On 17 April 1975, she was living with her large family in Phnom Penh. She described what happened when the Khmer Rouge soldiers entered her home, and I quote, "It was the time when the Khmer Rouge soldiers came to threaten me to ask me to leave our home. That's why I rushed to the safe to insert the combination, and I was about midway through, then I was pointed the gun at and forced to leave the home. And my husband had to go with my youngest daughter with some luggage, where he had to be led to another direction from ours." End of quote. Ms. Auri also described being threatened by armed Khmer Rouge soldiers. And I quote, "They carried guns, and they used the guns to chase away the people. They threatened to kill anyone who did not want to leave, and that we all hate to leave." End of quote. Ms. Besapani testified that they fired shots into the air and chased us to go away, and Aung Pali stated that, "I saw people fire and pointing guns at others. I think my family saw this, and other families also saw this." Ms. Jumrumdul described how Khmer Rouge soldiers shot repeatedly at his home in order to expel the residents. And I quote, "In the evening, my grandfather, who was partly paralyzed, was in bed, and we did not leave Phnom Penh yet. The Khmer Rouge shot into our house. It could be from the M16 or the AK-47, but we still remained in the house. And a little bit before that, my grandmother lit the light, and then the Khmer Rouge shot again into the house. All of us, including my parents and my uncle, then decided to leave." End of quote. Ms. Pech Srey Paul describes threats and beatings she witnessed. And I quote, "Khmer Rouge soldiers beat the people who refused to leave Phnom Penh. The scene of beating the people with a gun butt, I witnessed that near Kliang Rumsev market." End of quote. Khmer Rouge soldiers were also deployed to prevent people from returning to their homes. In the words of Som Chia, and I quote, "There were soldiers, groups of soldiers, who were deployed to protect the city and to make sure that people could not re-enter the city. And it was true that people could never come back to the city after leaving it." End of quote. In sum, the city was to be emptied immediately at any cost. All residents had to leave without exception, mercy, or compassion. I ask your honors, would any Cambodian willingly leave a family member to die by the roadside? That is what the Khmer Rouge forced our people to do. The evidence also demonstrates that Khmer Rouge forces murdered the residents of the city who were not quick to comply with their orders. We submit that all of the crimes committed against the evacuees, the imposition of inhumane treatment, torture, killings, and mass death along the way, were an inherent part of the common criminal plan to evacuate the cities. These crimes are a direct and immediate result of the orders issued by the CPK Party Center. As Som Chia testified, without mistreating some of the people, we would not manage to empty the city. The crimes committed during the evacuation are consistent with everything the CPK leaders, including these accused, had done and authorized before this event. And they were consistent with everything they did afterwards. As I said earlier, Khmer Rouge soldiers were trained and indoctrinated to view the people in the cities as their enemies. Importantly, former Khmer Rouge soldiers who testified before Your Honors, confirmed that there were no rules that prohibited soldiers from mistreating or killing the evacuees. Mr. Kung Kim testified that there was no rule or regulation on not shooting people rendered to us. Keo Sampon argues in his brief that the forced evacuation was justified because of an imminent threat of an American bombardment. This is a blatant lie. It is the same lie that the Khmer Rouge forces told the evacuees on 17 April. The claim that the city was about to be bombed had no basis in reality on 17 April 1975, and it has no basis in reality today. It was a deliberate invention, obviously designed to render the population more compliant and make it easier for CPK troops to complete their mission. The same invention is now being put before you. There was no prospect of bombing, and Your Honors have heard that stated from numerous witnesses. It is also plainly obvious from the documentary evidence before you. The American shelling of Cambodia had stopped in 1973, earlier as a result of a law passed by the U.S. Congress. The Khmer Republic regime was toppled and its air force destroyed. There was absolutely no threat of a bombing. There was no enemy in the sky. In truth, as far as the CPK leaders were concerned, the only real enemies were those in the cities. And the way to deal with them was by breaking them up, suppressing, and subjugating them to CPK's rule of terror. The utterly inhumane treatment of the civilian population during the evacuation itself belies any notion that the evacuations were designed to protect as opposed to punish the population. In assessing the defense's utterly ridiculous claim regarding the fear of bombardment, you may ask yourself the following questions. 1. If they thought the bombing was imminent, why did the leaders go into Phnom Penh themselves with their entire entourage? 2. Why did they have all senior people of the party in the capital within days of its evacuation? 3. If Phnom Penh was going to be bombed, why did they evacuate every single city and urban center? And 4. Why did they not allow people to stay near the city and return within days of 17 April? Do not let yourselves be fooled. Even some of the evacuees recognized on 17 April that the claim as to the supposed imminent bombardment was untrue. Mr. Panya Thai shared with Your Honors his thoughts at the time, and I quote, "Why Americans bother to drop bombs on Phnom Penh when they already left the city and the country? They left this country as early as of April, and the war was over. Why should they bomb us?" End of quote. Of course, all came to know the truth in due course. Many, including former Khmer Rouge soldiers, had the courage to tell the truth before this chamber. I will refer to a few. Chau Ni. I never heard any bombs dropped by the American warplanes. Misaran also said, "No bomb was dropped," and I was thinking that, in fact, they told us a lie. And Mr. Chum Sukha stated that when we reached our village, we knew that the plan was not that the people had to be evacuated because we were to be bombed. As for Mr. Somchi, the former Khmer Rouge soldier, he stated that that was part of their plan to deceive people by saying that soon the fighting would explode and everyone would die. By doing so, they believed that people could leave the city quickly. I will now turn to examine in more detail the evidence of the inhumane conditions imposed on the evacuees. From the moment the residents of Phnom Penh left their homes and embarked on this forced journey into the unknown, they were virtual slaves and prisoners of the armed Khmer Rouge forces who escorted them. Pitsray Paul stated, quote, "The atmosphere was very tense, and the Khmer Rouge soldiers did not allow us to walk freely. We were escorted by armed Khmer Rouge soldiers all along." End of quote. The evacuees crowded the streets. They included men, women, children, the elderly, amputees, people in wheelchairs, and hospital patients. The vast majority traveled on foot, some pushing rickshaws, bicycles, or wheelbarrows, carrying their belongings or sick family members. Some had cars which ran out of petrol quickly and were abandoned or confiscated by the Khmer Rouge. The conditions imposed on the evacuees caused enormous suffering. This included having to travel at an excruciatingly slow pace, exposed to the elements during the hottest month of the year, without shelter, water, food, or medical assistance. They were deprived of liberty and subject to constant threats and abuse. The march continued for days, and for many evacuees, for weeks. Death was inevitable, and indeed followed in thousands of cases. It is impossible in the course of this address to provide a comprehensive account of the suffering, so what I will describe as small clips of an enormous picture of human misery and death. While each and every individual within the millions of evacuees suffered, those whom the evacuation affected most severely were the sick, the injured, the elderly, pregnant women and the very young. Cheng Eng Lee's testimony highlighted the horrific effect of the evacuation order on the elderly people, and I quote, "The elderly people at large, and my mother was no exception to this. They were shocked, and they had no choice but to leave their home, because they were actually forced to leave at gunpoint." End of quote. Francois Poncho, who saw wounded and sick people on Monivong Boulevard, forced to leave the hospitals in the height of the hot season, testified that the foreseeable consequences were sooner or later they would die. That was the only eventual result. Those who physically could not leave and had no relatives to help them were abandoned to die. Shinny Sandberg testified that those who were too sick to move at all were left alone in the hospitals to starve and die. Yim So-wan witnessed the sick left to die at Boray Kaila Hospital. Miss Saron, who was a nurse there, testified in court that medical personnel were ordered to abandon hundreds of wounded and sick people behind, including an 8-year-old girl whose stomach was cut open and intestines were coming out of her body. The girl grabbed onto his shirt and begged him to carry her to go with him, but he had to leave her behind with the others. He said, and I quote, "Frankly speaking, I felt uncomfortable to leave the patients behind. I could not do anything more. In my mind, if I left them behind, 1, they would die, and 2, if the Khmer Rouge would come to help them, then they would survive." End of quote. And Som Chia confirmed the same at what is today Kermet Hospital. Shinny Sandberg also saw many sick patients on the road leaving the city, including those being pushed on beds and all kinds of things with bottles of serum hanging from the bed, and they were all being forced out of the city. But he added, "I saw no medical care being given by any doctors or nurses."
Mr. Nu Huon gave a vivid account of the suffering and death that surrounded the evacuees. Quote, "There was a huge crowd of people en route, and it was in the middle of the dry season, and the weather was very hot. People were shocked. They did not bring much belongings with them. Some of them did not have any songs or shoes, so they resorted to using banana stalk for their feet. Some of them lost their children and their families, and the situation was chaotic. We did not know where we would go and obtain some food, and there were flies. Flies were everywhere, like a cloud of bees. Some people died and left along the street. And those who were sick could not seek any help from anyone, and we were forced by Angkar to just keep going. So some of us would have to leave their sick family members behind." Chao Ni testified that, quote, "There were sick people who fell and were sitting on the side of the road, and there were dead people and nobody could have anybody else, end quote. Francois Ponceau testified that he saw cripples who were crawling like worms. Mom Som Eun saw hospital patients struggling with IV drips on the road. Lai Sopani saw patients with oxygen masks on. Lai Boni saw women giving birth and miscarrying in the street. Saint Sivata, 9 years old at the time, testified that she could not hold back her tears at having to walk among dead bodies, and at seeing a misery of a man near death in the street, crying as ants crawl all over his body. Panjathai saw 2 women who had hanged themselves at 2 different locations. Pich Sripal, a mother who had just given birth, described her grief at watching her baby die of hunger and thirst. Quote, I had no breast milk to feed my young baby. I did not have medicine, and I did not also have milk. My baby died during the evacuation, and I did not even know what to do with my dead body. I was instructed to bury my baby in the forest. It was like an animal. Unquote. She further described the Khmer Rouge soldiers' complete lack of regard for human life. Quote, while en route, when those people who were trying to return to Phnom Penh to collect their belongings or other things, they were stopped by the Khmer Rouge. And also, en route, when a family member was sick and they wanted to accompany them, they were forced, threatened by the Khmer Rouge soldiers, and they also fired into the air to threaten them to leave. Mom Som Eun further describes the abuse which Khmer Rouge soldiers meted out to the civilians. Quote, Khmer Rouge soldiers kept threatening people to move faster, and they were always pointed guns at. I would see dead bodies, pregnant women with difficulties. We were under strict surveillance by the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Kum Vandi was a 12-year-old evacuee traveling out of the city toward Troi Jongwa Bridge. He saw a man who was separated from his children. He testified as follows, quote, I saw one man. He was shouting that he lost his children, and when he approached the Khmer Rouge soldier who was standing, he asked for permission to return to find his children. But the Khmer Rouge soldier shouted back at him to move ahead. Otherwise, he would be dead. And he used the word dead. And then that man was on his knees begging the Khmer Rouge soldier. And the Khmer Rouge soldier hit his back with his rifle. And then the man fell onto his face on the ground. Unquote. As the roads were crowded with people, there were frequent instances of the separation of family members. Many people did not know where they were being marched to, nor how long the journey would last, and this added to their fear. Denis Afonso told Your Honors, quote, "We had no idea where we were going. That was even worse," unquote. The CPK leaders, highly educated and sophisticated people, knew that the forced movement of such a mass of people would inevitably cause tremendous human misery and deaths on a mass scale. Yet, they did not provide any support or assistance to the evacuees, even to those who were visibly ill or struggling. Sumjir, the former Khmer Rouge soldier who testified before Your Honors, said that soldiers were not told how, where, or when the evacuees would obtain food and water. In fact, he said everyone had to be left to his or her own, and there was no such policy as to providing any assistance to any of them. Experts confirm this fact. David Chandler described the condition of the forced transfer as colossally harsh from the start. Philip Short discussed this in more detail before Your Honors. He says, and I quote, "In more normal circumstances, a population movement of that kind would have been very carefully prepared. There would have been medical stations, or at least some kinds of medical assistance available along the way. There would have perhaps been some kind of transport organized. There would have been food supplies along the way. But none of that was done." The President. Thank you, Madam Prosecutor. The time is now appropriate for the afternoon adjournment. The Chamber shall adjourn now and resume at 3 this afternoon. The Court is now adjourned.
Sure.